So my topic is the advent of the telegraph in colonial Algeria, and more specifically, I'm going to be forwarding you a book about this topic that, it came out, I think, sometime around last year, and I thought it was pretty compelling. So the book here is Electric News in Colonial Algeria. It's by Arthur Asaraf. He is a professor either at Oxford or Cambridge. I'm not sure. He was at one or the other, but then he moved to the other. I'm not sure. You could check. It's on Twitter. But broadly, his book analyzes circulation of news in Algeria. And the period he's talking about is late 19th century, early 20th century. And I mean, as a whole, he's demonstrating the changes provided by new technologies, such as printing press, telegraph, cinema, radio, as they interacted with older sort of things that we might not consider to be media, songs, rumors, letters, manuscripts. So, I mean, I'm going to be focusing today on the telegraph and basically sort of relaying his observations, arguments, while also adding sort of some of the things I found compelling of what I got out of it. So, and I know it sort of sounds boring, but there's a point to this that hopefully I'll get to. But in terms of the telegraph as a technology in Algeria, one of the big things to first, understand is that Algeria is not a colony. Was not a colony of France. Algeria is considered to be a département of France, the fourth department of France. And because of that, it has a pretty large settler population, Pied Noir. At its height, there was about 1 million Pied Noir settlers all around the coast of Algeria. And in terms of the telegraph, it was a big change. So, before, if you wanted to get a message from Marseille to Algiers, it would take 50 hours. But now with a telegraph, it takes only 10 minutes. And this was really important in terms of connecting the Pied Noir population to metropolitan France, as well as doing practical logistical things like military sort of dispatches. So I mean, it was primarily a military technology. It was a way to connect the metropole to Algeria. But I mean, it's sort of, you can see it as a technology of redistributing space. Whereas now, you have Algeria, which is, it was not that far away, but now it's a lot closer to metropolitan France. And as a result, it redistributes how one views themselves vis-a-vis different parts of the world. But the big question here is, we're talking about Pied Noir settlers, but how are Algerian Muslims getting their news? Because at this point, you have a population of around 7-8 million, high illiteracy rates. I mean, education is pretty sparse. Either you're going to be just learning basic Quranic Arabic or rudimentary French to get some sort of lowly civil service job. So the way people are getting their news is in what the author's talking about in very specific transfer points. Algerians, for example, during World War I, they served in the French army, and they would send telegraphs to their families. But the issue was, it's not like everyone had a telegraph at their house. So a figure that becomes pretty important in the book is to put it simply, the guy in this town or village who happens to, read and speak French. And this guy could be, just some sort of educated person or lowly civil servant, but it's through these sort of particular intermediaries that people are getting their news. So for example, 1897, there was a war between Ottomans and Greeks over the island of Crete. Ottomans win, and when the news arrives to Algeria, there was a lot of commotion. And if you read French primary sources, there's a moment in Kabylia where the French authorities are they talk about these Algerians who are chanting that the Ottoman Sultan is going to come save them. And they're sort of confused about, well, what are they talking about? you know, like one, how are they getting this like new messages, and two, like why do they see this as sort of something relevant to them? And I mean, that gets to the bigger sort of question about news itself. For Asarov, news is, he has a pretty broad definition of news. It's time sensitive. He views news as stories being told about recent events, but most importantly, they need to be relevant to a particular person. So I could break my arm, and I mean, maybe it might be relevant to some of you. You might, but it's not news, right? The big thing about news is that it has to sort of inspire some sort of affective response out of people. And because of that, I mean, it tells you, you know, what people find close and what people find far. And I mean, something like newspapers, like, or mass media today, for Asarov, that's just one particular form of news. And he sees news as more of a creative process between the source and the receiver of the news. And it's this sort of interplay that creates this imagined world that, you know, I think we all inhabit at times. But I mean, for several examples, at this point for Algerian Muslims, it's interesting to note that, I mean, in terms of what people were caring about, what people found relevant, wasn't really things going on around the region. I mean, for example, Morocco and Tunisia wasn't as relevant for Algerians as, you know, news coming out of the Ottoman Empire. In their view, the Ottoman Empire was seen as like the sort of last strong Muslim power. And you know, I think that might be a result of just how people were like coming to identify themselves. Because, for example, being Muslim was a legal category in colonial Algeria. So, I mean, nowadays we talk about Arab, Amazigh, like all these different categories, but for a lot of people, really, they just saw themselves as Muslim. And the category l'indigent, that was the, you know, juridical category for Muslims at the time that basically deprived them of any sort of civic rights. That was really what was binding them together as sort of like a political entity. So the big thing is just seeing how Algerians relate to other Muslims. I mean, as you see in the slide, this is a picture of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. It's funny that he was seen as, you know, he was seen as sort of a righteous champion of Islam. And it's funny to say that because, I mean, you knowing the history of Ataturk and like sort of secularization policies in Turkey, that would be a very like weird take to have. And I mean, Algerians weren't that naive. I mean, if you look at different newspapers or publications, they talk about like, yeah, you know, banning of hijab, all this stuff, that was sort of problematic, but all they really saw with with Ataturk is this idea of like, this is a strong Muslim power, and perhaps, you know, if things go our like way, we might be able to be just as strong and, you know, have some sort of chance against the French. So, and a big thing to note is also the place of Algerian Jews. You know, this is a historic community, and one of the big differences that you find in Algeria, apart from other colonial contexts, is the Algerian Jews were actually citizens of the French state. In 1870, the Khmir Decree gave them French citizenship, basically as a means to, one, they believed that like Jews like had some sort of natural affinity to Western civilization as opposed to Muslims, but they also did it as a way to sort of bifurcate Algerian society. But this is all to say, they also acted as intermediaries for these particular nodes and transfer points of news, especially when it came to stuff going on in the Middle East. For a lot of Algerians, things going on in the Levant would be pretty relevant later when you get into the sort of the interwar period. But sort of the big thing I want to really get to is this this idea of an anxiety of colonial administrators, because what you end up finding is that for French officials, they keep writing about this paranoia they have of Algerians communicating with one another. They can't really understand how people are getting their news, how people are making sense of the world, and why these different global events are having an effect on the colonial population. And I mean, a big part of this is, they were very scared of Hajj. They didn't like the idea of Algerians going to congregate with other Muslims who they also saw as other colonized people, and also saw like maybe they might get ideas. And, they did a lot. There was, to varying degrees, they did a lot to sort of try to, limit that, but also they did things like run their own newspapers, run their own publications to try to disseminate particular kinds of news that they wanted Algerians to see. But what they didn't realize was that, a lot of people weren't getting their news from reading. People were getting their news from going to a cafe, listening to some guy who seemed to know some things. And I think that's really important, because what comes to happen is the French start to talk about these dark networks that Algerians are operating under, or like mainly Algerian, like specifically Muslims, these dark like networks of Muslims like plotting, and it's just something they can't see, something they totally can't even just comprehend, something outside of like, the like Western civilized imaginary. And that gets to something I hope, I don't know if anyone here grew up in France or speaks French, this idea of téléphone arabe, Arab telephone. So to my knowledge, I don't know if people still use it. It would be sort of messed up if people still use it. But this is the name for the game we call telephone, where you tell someone a sentence and they go down the line and see what this sentence ends up becoming, right? It's a cute childhood game. But also, this is where, téléphone arabe comes from. This idea that Muslims are working in these dark networks and, these sort of perverse, like, modes of messaging. Because, it was a secret network that was, like, inefficient, but also full of lies, because Arabs couldn't possibly, have the ability to, do like things like this. And it's interesting because how to say this, I think it's pretty relevant on how we see things nowadays, whether it's we tend to I would say reduce people's political decision making to the particular medias that they consume. So for example, I mean, I think a big sort of narrative in any sort of extremist case would be like, oh, this person went on YouTube or some forum and they watched some video and then they got radicalized. And it's this idea that there are networks that aren't on the surface that are connecting people in ways that like we can't really understand, and that's why people are getting radicalized. That's why we're having all these problems. One, it divorces the state from any sort of culpability, as well as just not addressing any sort of, I don't know, societal issues. And I mean, as like Frantz Fanon said, he said this later in terms of during the war for independence, the importance of radio and mass violence to the success of anti-colonial struggle. He argued that allowed the colonial subject to overcome a state of subservience. Basically, I'm trying to highlight this sort of interplay between, I don't think it's simple enough to say, for example, like, the conservative has these ideas because they watch Fox News. No, it's more that people are not just mere receptors of news, propaganda, of just any sort of ideas, but they're active participants in a process of reimagining their place in the world. So for example, for Algerian Muslims, this was an active process in reimagining and also changing the landscape of, like the social landscape of the region. So for example, the Ottoman Empire, Algiers was a regency of the Ottoman Empire, but through the advent of the telegraph and through these introductions of the technologies, the Ottoman Empire actually ended up being closer in the minds and like daily happenings of Algerians than when they were actually like a sort of colonial power in Algeria. And I find that to be very interesting. And I mean, it just sort of shows how, news, rumor, hearsay are all part of these larger processes that build new sort of social geographies. But also they, as much as we can say that news connects us, they also create a lot of fractions. They create they polarize, they create fractions. So in Algerian society, these sort of modes of getting news create large fractions between, European settlers, Algerian Jews, Algerian Muslims that would eventually coalesce into the dynamics that you see during the War of Independence and the modern state. But I think that's it.